The year is 2011. F1 was in full swing of the Red Bull and Vettel domination era, winning 12 of the 19 races this season. And yes, before 2023, that was what we thought Red Bull domination looked like. Vettel would go on to win the championship by 122 points to his closest rival Jenson Button, and Red Bull would win the Constructors' Championship by 153 points to McLaren. But under this domination, we saw something magnificent. Some fans would even say the best race of the decade. Some would even go further and say the best race of all time. This is the story of the 2011 Canadian Grand Prix. So for this race, there is a few things that you'll need to know before the actual race starts. This was the 7th race of the 2011 season, and Vettel so far had been dominating, winning 5 of the last 6 races, meaning coming into Canada, Vettel had an astonishing 143 points in the championship, with the next closest person, Hamilton, with 85 points. The gap was already ridiculous, and it was set in stone that Vettel would go on to potentially win the championship. However, I do have to mention, bar Australia, none of these races were really clear-cut wins. The gaps weren't incredibly big, so the racing wasn't terrible. It's just Vettel was in absolutely brilliant form in that Red Bull. And honestly, going into qualifying, the status quo pretty much stayed the same, with Sebastian Vettel taking pole position. However, this time, ahead of Fernando Alonso in 2nd place, with Fernando Alonso's teammate Felipe Massa in 3rd, Mark Webber in 4th. The only real difference we had seen this season so far was the McLarens not having a brilliant weekend so far, with Hamilton only in 5th, with Jenson Button in 7th. Both pretty far off the pole position pace of Vettel. So let the race begin. 5 red lights and nothing? Well, going into the race, there was already drama, with the rainfall before the race meaning that there was a safety car start all the way up until lap 4. Not the best start to the race, considering I have just described it as potentially one of the best races of all time. However, it sets the scene for a lot of what is to come. So now, the race has started at the end of lap 4, with Alonso fancying his chances on the restart, but Vettel blocked him off superbly. And right behind these two, Hamilton dived it down the inside of Mark Webber, sensing space for an overtake. However, in the tricky conditions, got it all wrong and sent Webber spinning, and almost collected himself in this little spin as well, dropping down to 7th, with Webber dropping down all the way to P14, with a lot of work to do for the rest of the race. But luckily for Hamilton, Jenson Button, his teammate in McLaren, went wide and Hamilton was able to re-overtake him for a brief period of time. And the reason I say this is because going into lap 7, Hamilton and Button just continued to fight each other back and forth, leading to Button and Hamilton losing time to both Mercedes and the front pack of Vettel in the Red Bull and both Ferraris. And while all of this was going on, Vettel decided to cut down some grass through turn 3 and 4. And if things were to stay the same, it was looking very gloomy for McLaren. But my oh my, did they not realise how much worse it could get.
For that first corner in, will Lewis Hamilton get another drive-through penalty? What do you think?
Well, I think in that case, there's no question as we see McLaren's touch.
This would lead to a safety car coming out, Jenson Button speeding behind the safety car, getting a drive-through penalty that he had to serve, and Lewis Hamilton being out of the race, which when Button served this penalty, he would be all the way down to P15. And then from the end of lap 8, with the safety car, to lap 15, 16 and 17, this is where the conditions started to get a little bit better, and a few teams decided that it was time for the intermediates. My oh my, could they have not been more wrong. By lap 19, the rain was torrential, and no one could see a thing. And to put it into context, it was so bad that the safety car had to be pulled out for the 3rd time in the race before even 20 laps had taken place. And with the rain not stopping anytime soon, eventually, by lap 25, the red flag got called out. And this would be one of the longest breaks in an F1 race recorded, with a 2-hour red flag waiting for the rainfall to stop, meaning throw away all of the rhythm that any car got into. They were basically starting completely new again, like the race had not started. Oh, and also, after all of the mayhem with the pit stops, some drivers going on to intermediates, then having to go back onto the wets, after all this carnage, the top 10 eventually looked like Sebastian Vettel in 1st, my main man Kobayashi in 2nd, a brilliant race he had had up to this point so far, Massa, Heidfeld, Petrov, De Resta, Webber, then Alonso, then De La Rosa, and Button rounding up the top 10. And even when the race could resume, there was another 9 laps behind the safety car until the actual restart on lap 34. Meaning, at this point in the Canadian Grand Prix, 23 of the 34 laps had been completed under safety car conditions. Absolute carnage. But on the restart, this time Vettel got it spot on with no one getting anywhere close to him. But further down the grid, Button had a great restart, getting past De La Rosa's Sauber for 9th. But now, since they had waited so long to get the start back on with so many safety car laps, this was now crunch time to see exactly when and what tyres to go onto for the race. A lot of people thought it was still time for wet. A lot of drivers thought it was intermediate times. And a lot of drivers thought maybe we could stick it out for slick tyres. And amidst all this chaos, Jerome D'Ambrosio, just saying his name makes me a bit hungry, very similar to a goated custard brand, managed to get one of the weirdest penalties I've seen in F1, having incorrect tyres on. So basically what had happened over at Virgin was that they had switched D'Ambrosio to the intermediate tyres when he was actually on wets before the safety car returned to the pits, which was not something you could do before a restart. So all of this accumulated onto drivers trying to stick it out on the wets, a lot of drivers coming in for the pits onto the intermediates and rushing through the pack, trying to make as much work as they can on them, meaning that a lot of them were in the same area of the track at the same time. And it was mental. So many cars trying to get past, blocked. It was chaos. I don't know how there wasn't any more crashes involved in this situation. But it was good for the likes of Schumacher and Button, who managed to get up to 10th and 12th before the front runners went on to the intermediates. And this is when a lot of the front runners on the wet tyres decided it was too much and they had to switch to the intermediates, which Ferrari did in a very Ferrari way.
We've got both the Ferraris in. They're going to have to queue up. Did I see that correctly? We've got Massa is in and Alonso as well. Alonso's going to have to queue up behind. Well, he's just out of camera shot. Look at that. He's going to lose even more time.
Well spotted then, and nearly an unsafe release surely from Ferrari.
I honestly just don't think Ferrari and Canada mix. You know, you've had the few exceptions. You know, we've seen Vettel win there in 2018. However, bar that, you have 2011 completely screwed up their pit stops, leading to Alonso having a lot of work to do. You have 2019 where Vettel went wide, actually did exactly the same thing he did in this race earlier and got a penalty, losing the race to Hamilton. And then you also had 2024, both of the Ferraris DNFing. It was a masterclass from them there as well. Ferrari and Canada don't mix. And after all of this chaos in the pit stops, it meant that Alonso eventually got out of the pit lane just in front of Button.
That Ted, and we got a Ferrari off. It's Fernando Alonso's beat the Ferrari inside of Alonso. Alonso didn't want to yield.
This would mean that Button has now had his second crash of the race, a drive-through penalty. It really wasn't looking like this was his weekend, as this collision would also give him a puncture, meaning he had to go into the pits for a new set of intermediate tyres and then regain all of those positions he had just worked so hard to get to. And of course, another safety car was called out, leading him to be dead last in 21st place in the Grand Prix with less than half of the race to go. Surely nothing good could come out of this for McLaren. Well, over the next 13 laps, he would climb all the way up to P8 before his next pit stop, showing magnificent pace coming out of the pits in 10th, already back into the points with dry tyres on, ready to go to the end of the race. Oh, and also sadly for Kobayashi, both Schumacher and Massa passed it, meaning the podium was completely off for him. Sad times, because what a guy Kobayashi is. But with Schumacher in second place, 11 seconds off Sebastian Vettel, it looked dead set for Vettel to completely run away with this race. Lap 52. Button would go into 9th after De La Rosa pitted. Oh, and do you remember that Ferrari curse I was talking to you about? So now, Button was up to P7 as Rosberg also pitted this lap. Lap 54, Button was now past Vitaly Petrov. So Button was now up to 6th, right behind Kobayashi and Heidfeld. Lap 55, Button overtakes Heidfeld and Kobayashi for 4th, a whole second quicker a lap now than Vettel in 1st. The gap was now down to 18 seconds between Vettel and Button. Bear in mind, at one point of the race, Button was around 100 seconds behind Vettel. And then on lap 56, Heidfeld trying to get past Kobayashi, hitting the backside of Kobayashi and losing his front wing underneath his car. This would lead to Heidfeld crashing out of the race and leading to a whole other safety car coming out. Meaning that for this race, this was the 6th time a safety car had been called out. So come to the end of lap 60, the top 10 looked like this. Vettel in first, Schumacher in second, Webber in third, Button now up to fourth, with Kobayashi in fifth, Petrov in sixth, Barrichello in seventh, Alguersuari in eighth, Rosberg in ninth, and the GOAT, the one and only Maldonado, up into 10th. And I mean, that is just a ridiculous top 10 for 2011, as those cars were Williams, Saubers, Renaults, not cars that should have been there, but with so many blunders from the top teams, it was making some good racing for the midfield to pick up some points. But also, more importantly, this safety car now meant that the full pack was completely together again, and it had left a very clear dry line for the drivers to use. However, they had to be extremely careful as it was completely still wet off of this line, making overtakes extremely difficult, which we would come to find out on lap 64 when Webber, trying to get closer to Schumacher, completely screwed up his braking point going onto the wet part of the track, missing the chicane, letting Button sweep past him, tiptoeing to make sure he didn't crash his car up into third place, with Schumacher his next target. Lap 65, Button was all over Schumacher's backside, edging closer and closer until the back straight where he finally got the overtake done, going up into second place, meaning that the gap now from Vettel to Button was only 4 seconds with only a few laps left to go. Lap 68 and 69, Button tried to get into the DRS of Vettel, but he could just not get past Vettel, as Vettel just had enough pace to keep him in that gap with the dirty air, so Button was really struggling to get into the DRS to go for an overtake. And going in to the final lap, the gap was now 0.9 tenths. So Button had to have one of the best laps of his career to get past Vettel. And my God, let me just show you the whole lap.
In that corner, but it's not a brilliant overtaking opportunity anyway. So what's the gap as they go over the line? Vettel leads as he goes into the final lap by 0.9 of a second. Button at 1:16.9, the new fastest lap of the race. Jenson Button driving for his life, driving for the victory. Has Vettel got what it takes to hold him off? I think Vettel's got weight. Yeah, he's got weight. He turned in too late. He got the tyres. Button leads the Grand Prix. Sebastian Vettel turned in with his tyres just touching the water. It's the final lap of the Grand Prix. We see Vettel finally cracking. He's made a mistake. He is still going to finish second. That means he's never been outside the top 2 this year. But Sebastian Vettel finally shows he's human because of the pressure that this man, Jenson Button, put on him. And all sorts going off in the final chicane here, but they're out of Button's way. Lots of traffic fighting here. Jenson Button into the pit straight. He wins a brilliant race. It's a sensational drive for Button. What a victory. And Vettel...
Button had done it after leading only around half a lap of the race, being dead last after the halfway point of the race, having a drive-through penalty, a puncture, and crashing into 2 cars. He had managed to win the Canadian Grand Prix. And I honestly have to say, there is a little bit of bias here. This has to be my favourite F1 race of all time. It just had everything that is so raw with F1. It had changeable conditions. It had multiple safety cars. It had brilliant overtakes. It had an underdog story. It had crashes. It had carnage. It had everything that you want from F1. And I mean, also, Kobayashi almost got a podium. How great would that have been if he was on the podium as well? However, it wasn't meant to be. But like I mentioned, this is the raw side of F1. Like, you have other great races like 2010 Abu Dhabi, which are great, but because there's like championship fights going on, and it's a lot more to do with the point situation than the actual racing. And this is just an individual race in a random season that wasn't even spectacular for a championship fight, and it was just incredible. So for a season that was dominated by Sebastian Vettel, the king had finally made a mistake. Jenson Button would win the first of his 3 race wins in 2011. Brilliant stuff. And that is all she wrote. 2011 Canada, I can't state enough how great that race was. Go watch the extended highlights, go watch the full race. It was just incredible. But thank you all so much for watching. Comment down below what has to be your favourite F1 race of all time. But thank you all so much for watching. Like and subscribe. See you all later. Take care.